There's a reason that Ponzi schemes are illegal. and that's because they can't continue indefinitely. They always fall apart. So there's always people holding the bag that end up losing money. And so, no, they can't keep the Ponzi going indefinitely because it's a Ponzi by definition. Now, governments can generally get away with it a lot longer than you and I could because they protect themselves. They kind of write the rules, but they can't, suspend the rules indefinitely. And the reason I think they can't really get away with it anymore is the way they've gotten away with it in the past is by creating inflation. That's how they do it. Quantitative easing is inflation by definition. It's just a better name. It's a euphemism. Because if the government said our policy is to create inflation, people would, well, I don't like that. I don't like inflation. That makes prices go up. So if they just call it quantitative easing, they don't get a lot of enemies. Although in Europe, they were even more abrupt. They kept saying, or even here, we need more inflation. They actually told us that. They said the problem is we don't have enough inflation. Like, we have a lot of problems. That was not one of them. Lack of inflation is not your problem. But the government said it was, and they had to solve it by creating more inflation. So that's what they did. Every time we had a problem, they created inflation to solve it. But they've created so much inflation at this point that inflation is now the biggest problem. And how do you solve the inflation problem with more inflation? You don't. So when we get the next economic downturn, when it's going to happen in an environment where you still have high inflation, right? It's not going to be 2% or any, close to it. Now, inflation's, let's say 4 or 5%, whatever it is. And unemployment really spikes. The banks start to fail and they print a bunch more money. And now you take that inflation rate and send it right into the double digit. That's it. The bond market, remember, you look at that chart of the bond market. All the time the Fed has been doing these policies, we've been in this secular bull market for bonds, which started in 1980, 81 and ended in 2020. So you had a 40-year bull market in bonds, which is now the beginning of a bear market, which who knows how long it's going to last. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be around for a long time. So now if the Fed is going to try QE in a bond bear, I don't think it's going to work. I think the next time the Fed prints money to buy bonds, bonds are going to go down. And of course, what are really going to go down are not just treasuries, but the bonds that the Fed is not buying. Because, the Fed buying of treasuries will offset some of the decline, but they're not going to buy all the treasuries, so other people would be selling. But what about the muni bonds? Who's going to buy them? What about corporate bonds? Rates are going to surge across the spectrum, but nobody can afford to pay. I mean, just look at the national debt. This is where it screams at you. The national debt is $34 trillion. It's growing by $1.25 trillion. In calendar 2024, something like $12 trillion of that matures, has to be rolled over. In addition to the $4 trillion of new borrowing, that's $16 trillion. Who's going to buy that? Right now, the Fed is selling. Fed's adding to the problem. You know who else is selling? Social Security. They were one of the biggest buyers of treasuries during that bull market. They're now one of the biggest sellers because Social Security, because so many people have dropped out of the labor force or retired, Social Security doesn't collect enough money in payroll taxes to cover the cost of the benefits of the people who are already retired. Not to mention the ones who are going to retire next week or next month. So they're selling treasuries. The other big buyer of treasuries were foreigners. Japan, China, they're not buying. I mean, they're selling too. So this is a huge problem. And again, the other point, interest on the national debt is about now the same as national defense. A year ago, it was nothing. It was $200 or $300 billion a year. Now it's almost $1 trillion. In another year or two, interest on the national debt, if interest rates just stay where they are, right? Don't go higher, which they could do. They just stay where they are. Interest will be more than Social Security or Medicare. It'll be the single biggest expense. In a couple of years, about 50% of every dollar the U.S. government collects in taxes, income taxes, Social Security taxes, 50 cents of every dollar will be needed just to pay the interest on the debt. Not pay back any of the debt, just the interest on the debt. And before the end of this decade, assuming that we can get there without a crisis, which I don't think is possible, but before the end of the decade, which is not that far away, 100% of government tax revenues will be for interest on the debt. Now, obviously, that circumstances can't exist. You can't have a government that simply transfers money to bondholders and has nothing left over for anything else. I'm not talking about, not even to pay the salaries of the people that clean the toilets in the Capitol. Nothing. No money for anything except interest on the debt. So this is how much this thing has ballooned out of proportion. Even Janet Yellen, a year ago or a year and a half ago, when she was asked if she was worried about the $30 trillion debt, she said, no, the debt didn't matter as long as the interest payments were low. That's what she said. I remember at the time saying, well, doesn't she realize that those interest payments aren't fixed? The Fed is going to be raising rates. I'm only worried about it when interest rates go up. Well, then you should worry about it now because interest rates are going to go up. But this is why the Fed is going to stop cutting rates. It's not because it's won its battle against inflation. It's lost. It's going to surrender. It's cutting rates because nobody can afford to pay. It's going to cut rates to prevent default, insolvency, right? But that's going to lead to runaway inflation. I've been trying to help people protect themselves from this crisis for a long time. And because we haven't had the crisis, people think, well, Schiff's wrong, right? He's preparing for, this crisis that's never going to happen. No, I'm preparing for a crisis that is going to happen. It's just happening later. But all of the things that make the crisis inevitable, all those problems not only still exist, but they're bigger. So the crisis looms even larger than it did a decade ago. We've just blown a bigger bubble. But while we've, kicked the can down the road, all these problems have gotten so much worse. And so what this means is that when we have the crisis, it's going to be much deeper because we've dug ourselves into a bigger hole. Now, again, maybe AI could soften the blow. Anything that the free market could do to counteract the damage that government does. That's basically the dance that we do. Capitalism is a positive force for good. The free market, which is constantly finding ways to increase abundance, make things better, make things cheaper, increase living standards. And then you have governments that are working at the exact opposite purpose. They're trying to undermine productivity. They're trying to add unnecessary burdens and regulations and red tape. They're trying to counteract the benevolent forces of the free market that want to allocate resources and labor to their highest and best use. Politicians want to allocate them to their friends, whoever's going to give them the most donations. And then you have the free market that is trying to lower prices and the government that creates inflation to push them up. So whatever the free market can do to undo the damage of government. But you can only imagine the world that we would live in today if government had stayed at the same size it was in 1900. Had we never had an income tax, had we never had a Social Security, had we never had a Federal Reserve, had the government stayed the same size it was in 1900, which was less than 5% of our GDP, had we had no government borrowing, right? Imagine the world that we would live in. What the world would look like. Look, I think that had the government not gotten involved, I think that, the typical family today would have one breadwinner, most likely the man, but it could be the woman. But you wouldn't have a husband and wife both having jobs. People wouldn't be moonlighting. You wouldn't have people with 2 or 3 jobs. My guess is by now, we'd probably be down to maybe 3 or 4 days a week working. So the weekends would probably be maybe 4 days long, 5 days long. We'd be so much more productive. We'd have a much higher standard of living. God knows what inventions we would have come up with, what drugs we would have come up with, without the FDA, screwing all that up. Maybe we would have cured cancer by now. Who knows, right? Maybe we would have developed AI a decade or 2 ago. I don't know. If you look at, America relative to the rest of the world, Americans had a standard of living in 1940, 1950 that was unrivaled. There was nothing like America. American capitalism created the middle class, which didn't exist in Europe. Americans used to go to Europe and there was an expression, the ugly American. And the reason that we were ugly is because Americans would go there and all of a sudden they'd be rich because everything was so cheap there. And so we would act kind of arrogant when we were there, just, not on purpose. Everybody was rich when they went to Europe because they were poor in comparison to Americans' middle class. But today, Americans don't live that much better than the rest of the world. In fact, there are a lot of countries that have higher standard of living than America. And the only reason our standard of living isn't much lower is because of all this debt. But that just means that in the future, our standard of living is going to come way down when this bubble bursts and we can't live beyond our means anymore. The wealth gap, I think, is going to continue to widen as a result of the Fed and government policy. Remember, the biggest wealth gap is in socialism or communism, right? You have a few people who work for the government that have all the wealth, and everybody else is in abject poverty, right? And yeah, there are a few people that are connected to the government that manage to get something. Capitalism is the great equalizer. That's what narrows the gap, and it creates a lot of wealth. Now, you're going to have some very rich people in capitalism, but they earn it because in capitalism, you're rewarded in proportion to your contribution. The more you benefit society, the more money you earn, because that's what profit is. Profit is the gain that's derived from doing good, right? If you're able to combine the resources in the economy that are scarce, right? The resources are scarce. So if you're going to use these resources, you need to use them efficiently. And if you could take these resources and create products and services that people value more than the resources it took to create them, you get rich because people buy what you have to sell. But a capitalist can't force somebody to buy anything. They have to voluntarily do it. People make a choice. I want to own that. I want to buy that because it's going to make my life better. And I'm going to give money to the company that made my life better. So the more money you collect, the more people's lives that you've improved. That's the invisible hand of capitalism. And that's the beauty of the system. But yes, there are going to be people that work harder, that are smarter, and do more good, and they're going to achieve more wealth. But you always have people who become envious of other people, and the politicians play on that envy, right? And they say, these people are rich, that's not fair, you should have more money. Vote for me and I'll steal their money and give it to you, right? Because you're more deserving, you're more caring, because they have their money because they're greedy, right? They're just ripping people off and exploiting their workers, right? That's what they tell you to get the votes. And people, yes, the reason I'm not rich is because I'm a good guy. I don't exploit people. I'm not cutthroat and evil, right? Like those rich people are. Because that's a way to kind of justify the fact that you're not rich. Instead of saying, I'm not rich because I don't work as hard. I'm not ambitious. I'm not as smart, right? That's why you're not rich.